I'm Dr. Jam Kothari.
And I'm Dr. Sally Moore. And this is a Myeloma Minutes, a podcast for people affected by myeloma, patients, friends and family.
Hi Sally, good to see you again.
Hi Jam, lovely to see you. How have you been?
Very good. Another episode of the Myeloma Minutes. It's been a few weeks now. And I think firstly, I'd like to say we really appreciate all the lovely feedback we've got on the first few episodes. It's come from patients via social media, through email, through patient support groups. So thank you so much. We're really listening to what you're saying, subjects you want covered. And I hope that as the year goes on, we're going to cover those topics and give you the content that you'd like to listen to.
Please do get in touch if there's any burning questions as we go along, or even about previous episodes that may have come out. Jam and I are so keen to hear your voices, and your queries. So keep all those queries and that feedback coming in. It really helps us too. So thank you for that. But Jam, without further ado, we are going to talk about something which I personally think on paper seems really dry, but I think we both agree is pretty important. So do you want to kind of tell us what we're going to chat about today and why we're having this conversation?
So we're going to talk about clinical trials. In our first ever episode, Sally, we talked about the amazing progress that has happened over the last couple of decades in myeloma. And it's clinical research, testing new treatments that has made that possible. The staple treatments that people have today, they've all been developed through the process of clinical trials, and that understanding and process continues today at pace. And there's so much, I think, to understand about trials. So today we're going to have a chat about what clinical trials and what clinical research means for myeloma.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't wait, actually. So please bear with us. And as questions pop up, particularly for those listeners who might be involved in the clinical trial or those who are considering it, get in touch and let us know. But before we kind of launch this, I don't know if you remember this, Jam. I think I'm showing my age here. But I remember being at university and it being a new thing to practice evidence-based medicine, which now seems so odd that you would do anything other. But everything that we do needs to be driven as much as possible, doesn't it, by the fact that we understand why we're doing it and how it may or may not help that person and impact on their outcome. So that's how we practice now day to day. But it wasn't always like that. But I think that is largely because of clinical trials and research that's taken this field forward. And I'm sure you'd agree with that.
Absolutely. As medicine has developed over the decades and centuries even, back in the day, I think it was eminence-based medicine, wasn't it? Rather maybe than evidence-based medicine. I'm a doctor. I am knowledgeable. This is the right treatment for you. And your patient would look at you cowering, go, okay, I'll do whatever you say. What, drink all of it? Yeah, it's fine. You'll be okay. But yeah, Sally, I think clinical research got a lot more organised and very much understood, and very clear ethical guidelines developed from the 60s onwards, where it was understood that the way to really understand the impact of certain treatments was by testing people in different groups and looking at the magnitude of effect. Before cancer treatments became better, as they have, a lot of the big evidence-based trials were in cardiovascular medicine in the 80s. Now, even something as simple as aspirin, right? Now, we know now that aspirin remains a very important drug for people with certain types of heart problems. But that was shown in big trials of thousands of people.
And also, let's not forget, just recently, it was only a few years ago, wasn't it? We were in the height of the pandemic, and we were so blessed that the UK set up this incredible trial which reported in real time the best treatment for COVID-19 for those people who are so terribly unwell, and therefore changed practice all over the world, really, as a consequence of that. So I think that's a really good example of clinical trials at their best can have incredible outcomes. And we really hope, or we know actually, lots of our listeners who are having treatment for myeloma, they'll be receiving that treatment courtesy of people who've engaged in trials in the past to prove that those drugs work, and may actually be sort of involved in trials going forward as well. But let's pause there, Jam, and shall we just spend a minute? Let's not go into too much detail because there's so much jargon, isn't there, around clinical trials. But should we just quickly have a chat about the different types of trials and what they're for?
So for a cancer such as myeloma, most of the clinical research, clinical trial activity is around testing new treatments or potentially new ways of using existing ones. So in our field, that could be looking at different combinations of different chemotherapies, looking at new ways of delivering treatments such as CAR T therapy or immunotherapy, and by using clinical trials to understand what treatments may be beneficial to our patients, over time, newer therapies become available. And I think, Sally, a really important topic that we wanted to cover in this session was how do doctors become aware of the results of clinical trials? And also, if a drug is shown to be effective, what does that mean for that drug potentially becoming available for routine use within the NHS, for example?
It's almost as if to say this drug works on this many people or these particular types of people, and therefore it should be available for those people if possible, knowing that there are caveats or conditions applied to that. It has to be cost effective, for example, which means that the effect that you gain from that drug isn't extraordinarily expensive. It's good value for money. And I think the NHS does that really well by and large. It makes sure that the best treatments that are out there are available for as many people as possible. And clinical trials really anchor that.
We should also say that there will also be trials available that don't necessarily look at new treatments. So it could look at new ways of monitoring myeloma. So for example, in Oxford, we're shortly opening a clinical trial looking at a new type of PET scan. So a type of whole body scan with a different type of tracer, which helps potentially identify myeloma cells in a unique and new way. So people's chemotherapy treatment remains a standard way, a standard treatment. And on top of the normal monitoring, we're going to be looking at this new type of scan. So it's a different type of trial. And there are also trials called observational clinical trials. Sally, what are they?
Yeah, observational trials are actually incredibly important. So that may be where you collect information on people who may or may not be having a particular treatment or be living with a condition, and you see how they get on. You might try and capture information about how they're feeling or any problems they may encounter or how long they can be observed for before they need treatment. And what's so useful about these trials is they then can help practice in the future in terms of how do you monitor other people going forward. So big data, I think there's been a lot of press attention on big data in the last couple of years, and the fact the NHS now wants to routinely collect data on many patients, and actually where does that data go, and is that data, can it be tracked down to your name and such like. But I guess I'd really like to reassure listeners that big data collection can be incredibly powerful and incredibly important for all of us.
So up and down the country, we have many different types of clinical trial running for multiple myeloma. And a number of people listening to this podcast will have been approached potentially for a clinical trial. So how does that happen, Sally? Does that happen within the clinic or within other areas? So you could be being diagnosed with myeloma at 1 p.m. and then 30 minutes later, someone says, "Oh, do you want to be in a trial?" And that's quite a lot to take in. How does it work?
It's totally overwhelming, I think. I think we ask a lot of the people that we work with and that we look after. In my dream world, my paradise for myeloma patients, or the people I look after, if I was to say that, I would sincerely like everybody to be offered or considered for a clinical trial because of that ongoing benefit for themselves and for other patients in the future. In particular, what tends to happen in clinic is your doctor may say, well, we think that you have X, Y, or Z, or you may benefit from having this treatment or that treatment. Oh, and you can also have this treatment in a clinical trial, meaning that we may be able to offer you a treatment you might not otherwise get, standard of care, or we can collect data on how well that treatment is working in a clinical trial, or that new intervention, as you've already mentioned, Jam. And therefore, the patient themselves is not only getting the gain from being in the trial, but as I said, people in the future will also gain from it as well. So people tend to be approached by a doctor and then a trials nurse who will give them some information about what the idea of the trial. Why are we doing this? What does it actually involve? For them to then take away, have a read, and think about whether they want to be involved or not. So I hope no one ever feels any pressure, but I also hope people need to be and are frequently, hopefully, very well informed about the benefits of a trial.
There will be a discussion between the doctor who's involved in the trial and the patient and their family. But as you said, Sally, they're given some written information, something called a patient information sheet. Now, this is a document written hopefully in plain English. And when I say hopefully that will become clear why I've said that over the next few minutes. And essentially that is a document which highlights the information about the trial, what we say the intervention is, whether it's a new drug, and it will explain what is known about that drug, the potential benefits, and also the side effects. And it will also highlight what the person who's going to enter the trial will have to do. For example, how often will they need to come into hospital? What sort of monitoring that will they need? How often will there be scans and bone marrow biopsies and other potential procedures? These documents are longer than they should be. They're probably somewhere between 20 and 30 pages. And I think what doctors in trials find difficult is that they do have to have a certain level of information in them that also acts as a legal source of ensuring that if someone does get, say, a particular side effect, it was documented in that information sheet, even though it's extremely rare. So you can read a patient information sheet and frankly be
confused and uncertain.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think you're given this wodge of paper after perhaps having a serious discussion about your health, and it may be at the same time trying to absorb that discussion, then expected to read this mini book. I mean, we ask a lot, don't we? However, that information is there for a reason, and I would hope that every trials nurse or doctor working in this field could talk you through the most relevant points that you need to glean from that to really help with your decision making going forward.
The information sheet is one thing, but I think the person giving it to you can hopefully really sort of distill the key points that you need to know.
Totally, and really make it a lot easier for everyone to really make their minds up, and in an objective way, without persuading someone, just sharing the facts with them. That's what you want, the facts to make your own mind up. But something else which is really important, which I think is a new area of research which is evolving, is it's all very well getting this 20-page document written in English if you've got good eyes, if you can understand the complex language, if English is your first language. But what if you don't? How do you then work with people who might have other barriers to understanding this information, yet still give them a fair shot at engaging with this important part of what we do? And so I think there's a lot of, ironically, research going on into this area to try and improve access to these trials, to make sure that everyone has an equal opportunity to take part. So really important area. But talking about that, Jam, talking about taking part in trials, so there's something called, we refer to eligibility. Do you want to explain that to me, what that might mean? Because I think that's also quite confusing as well.
So the information sheet has been given and there's been a good discussion. And then I think on balance, the patient and the doctor and the trials nurse decide, yeah, we're going to go for it. So there'll be a process where consent is signed. So a legal document is signed by both the participant and also the investigator, the person taking the consent. And then at that point, the eligibility is looked into. Okay. So when you are trying to understand how a new drug, for example, may work, it is important to try and get a population. So whatever number of people that you're looking at, you need them to have certain criteria met so that you can understand the effect of the treatment in terms of how well it works, but also the side effects. So for example, in myeloma, most trials will need people to have a certain level of myeloma to participate, so you can look at the change in the protein levels, for example, going up or going down, which determine potentially how well the treatment is working. And you often need people's kidneys to work at a certain level, their livers to work at a certain level, because drugs, new drugs, old drugs, the livers and the kidneys working at an adequate level is important for those drugs to be what we say metabolized or processed by the body. So there is a whole list of what we call inclusion and exclusion criteria that try and ensure that, number one, the participant is safe to go into the trial because the drug may have only been studied within certain parameters, and two, that you can measure effectively the effect of the drug. People will enter a trial after they've signed consent, but they may be ineligible for X, Y, or Z reason. For example, if they have other health conditions, it may be difficult to understand the effect of the drug because that condition is masking the drug effect, for example. Those are the things that need to be considered. And if you pass those sort of criteria, the inclusion and exclusion, then you can go ahead and be entered and start the treatment.
I mean, it's pretty black and white, isn't it, on this trial documentation, this list of things that you can't have or that you can have or you must have to get into the trial. And sometimes I read it and I think, God, it just seems really unfair. Just because someone might have had trouble with a heart a few years ago, which is fine now, they're for some reason not allowed to go into this trial. But I guess what's really important for us to share is it is for good reason. That good reason is so that if you're trying to figure out how well a treatment may or may not work, you need to make sure that other things aren't getting in the way and sort of there aren't other complications cropping up, which are either making that patient unsafe or making it really hard to figure out if this treatment is doing what it needs to do. But the one get around for that, and this is something else which I would strongly encourage people listening to explore, is actually seeing if there's any of these studies called the observational studies or the real world data, which is where you collect information on everybody having a particular treatment or intervention, regardless of what's going on within the background, because they're getting it anyway on the NHS, for example. And then you can pull all that information together and prove that hopefully it works in all of these people, perhaps not so well in these people, don't use that treatment in these individuals at all, for example, to really kind of open up that conversation about who gets the right treatment where and when.
Phases of trials, Sally. So we should talk about this because not all trials are created equal and they all happen at different stages of the development of a drug. So before a drug ever goes into a human, broadly they will have had extensive testing on animals, and even prior to that, testing in the lab to what people think the likely side effects are going to be and what it might mean for humans when the drug enters a human. So there will always be a point where a drug enters a human for the first time. So Sally, can we start with that and just take us briefly through the phases of clinical trials?
Yeah, so these are called phases, aren't they? The ones that we tend to use routinely in practice are phase 1, 2 and 3. And you basically work your way through the phases. As a drug is proven to work better and better, it goes up the phase. But to begin with, the early phase trial is where you've got a really good hunch that this particular treatment, for example, will be of benefit to this particular person, but you want to make sure it's safe. And so they're all about safety. So you give a tiny amount of that treatment, for example, to begin with, to a person with a particular condition, in our case with myeloma, and you make sure it's not doing harm, that it's actually hopefully going to be doing good. And then the next person who comes along, you might give a slightly higher dose, still in the same phase of trial, the early phase or phase 1 trial, again to just check it's as safe as it possibly could be. And at the end of trying these drugs at different doses on different people, you can then be confident that you're not harming somebody, and therefore you may hopefully also be doing some good. So that's an early phase or a phase 1 trial.
So by the time you've got to phase 2, there is a dose of the drug which has been defined in phase 1. And then phase 2 is really trying to rapidly increase our understanding of the drug. What are the side effects? What are the commonest side effects? What are potentially rarer side effects? And how well does the drug work? These phases often don't have what we call a comparator. So a comparator in a trial is where you might have 50 people having treatment A and 50 people having treatment B. And we should define the term randomized, because that's a very important term in trials as well. So when a trial is randomized, what that means is that people are allocated to one of any number of potential treatment arms that is done, as I say, broadly, it's done randomly. So a phase 2 trial can be randomized, where you basically have maybe 50 people having the new treatment and 50 people maybe having a different standard treatment or a different variation. But I think the key things about phase 2 is that people understand what dose they want to use of a new treatment, and the focus is on safety and also looking at potentially how well the drug works.
Great. So phase 1, safety. Phase 2, how well the drug works and safety. And then phase 3, that's where the randomization business comes in. So that's where you do tend to compare the treatment that you're thinking is great. You know, it's you're really excited about it. It's going to make a massive difference. But you need to show, is it as good as actually what's already available? And that's where you have that randomization, the roll of the dice. You either get the brand new treatment or you get the next best thing, which might be the pretty good actually in lots of cases that's available, let's say on the NHS or in that clinical trial. And you compare and you make sure this newer treatment stacks up against the best thing that's already out there. And that's your phase 3 trial really. So bigger groups of people tend to go, as you work your way up the phases, you tend to have an increasing number of people recruited or entering into these trials. And your phase 3 trials tend to be where you actually find out if this drug is good or this treatment is as good as you think it or you hope it should be.
To use a good example from myeloma, patients who are young enough to have stem cell transplants, routinely now we use a 4-drug combination. There were lots of trials over the last few years which basically looked at a standard 3-drug combination, and then you add the 4th drug on top of that, which most typically, more recently, has been an antibody drug such as daratumumab. And there were lots of trials saying, we know this is a standard good 3-drug combination, and then you add the 4th drug on top of that. There was about, I think, 300 to 400 people in both arms of the study. And then you look at their progress over time, over a number of years, actually. And that was shown, for example, that a 4-drug combination is better than a 3-drug combination. And then that emerges as a new standard of care.
And it takes a while for these trials to report. You often need to collect, particularly as the drugs work better, you need to follow people up for longer and longer and longer to then prove the point that this is so much better. But it does then filter through to day-to-day practice. And then you've got phase 4 trials, haven't you, Jam, which we don't tend to recruit so much to, but that's more looking at sort of more long-term side effects and collecting those sort of even a bigger population of data. So what people tend to encounter, I think, in our practice day-to-day is phase 1, phase 2 or phase 3.
To recap some of the key points, having that discussion with your doctor about whether a trial is right for you is really important. The patient information sheet should be read in conjunction with that discussion that you have. Take some time. You don't need to decide there on the spot. That's a very important point to make. You have a number of days, often longer, if you want to weigh up the pros and cons for you about taking part in the trial. Speak to other patients, speak to your friends, speak to your family. You can even reach out to a number of the charities that are involved. If you do consent and you enter the trial, you go through that eligibility process, which is a very important part. And in lots of trials, maybe 15 to 20% of people will not be eligible, unfortunately. But that doesn't mean necessarily that you won't be eligible for a different trial. And I think a really important point to make is that you will still have good treatments available that are not trial-based. And I agree, Sally, most of the trials that we get involved with are phases 1, 2, or 3. Sally, if someone signs consent to a study and they enter it and they have the first few doses of the drug and think, well, actually, you know what? I don't like this. I feel uncertain. I think this drug has given me side effects. Oh, but I've signed up now. I'm in. Do they have to stay on the trial? What happens?
No. And thank you so much for raising that. You can always change your mind. And actually on the consent form, it more often than not says you're free to withdraw at any time without affecting your medical care. It's really up to you. It's in your hands as a person being involved. The team around you, if you object, you don't even have to tell them why. You just say, thanks, but no thanks, I'm out of here. And that's okay. And then you will, you'll go back and receive treatment off trial on the NHS in our case. So absolutely, really important, free to withdraw at any time. And one last thing perhaps to mention on this piece is that there may be extra bits you can do in the trial only if you want to, which you can still perhaps get access to treatments on the trial, but the trial may also say, can we actually store a little bit of your blood as well? But it doesn't matter if you don't want us to do that, you can still get the treatment. So there are opt-ins and opt-outs as you go along as well, and you can adapt, how you're managed in that trial according to your preferences and how you're getting on day to day.
Throughout the country, there are many different trials for myeloma at those different phases that we talked about, Sally, that phase 1, phase 2 and phase 3. There's a lot of work that goes on with trials, from the staffing to trial pharmacists making up the new drugs, the doctors that monitor all the patients and clinical trial nurses. How are trials funded, Sally? Who pays for them and what does that mean?
Can I just ask you a really quick question before I answer that point? So often, I think there is a fear that going into a trial means that you're going to be a guinea pig. And I think that's partly because people think that that trials are set up to make money and you need somebody to experiment on. Can you tell me how you answer that when your patient says it to you in clinic? And then I'll come to the next point, because I always find it really tricky.
It's not unusual for people to sometimes think that. Clinical trials are highly regulated, and appropriately so, because the central point of them is to protect the participant. And there are international guidelines that are very clear in that all clinical research, the participant has to be at the centre and protected. And all the information that we've talked about over the last half an hour or so, the patient information sheet, the eligibility, the discussions, it's all around making sure that the patient is not a guinea pig. They are an informed participant in a process which eventually leads to the development of new drugs. And if people say that to me, we'll have a long chat about it. And clinical trials are not for everybody, because some people just feel more comfortable saying, look, I understand that it's important, but I know that this treatment has had, thousands of people have had it. The side effects are much better defined. I think it works okay for me. And that's completely fine. And I think sometimes I felt it, Sally, that some people feel like they're letting you down if they're not going into a clinical trial. And they're absolutely not. And I think if someone says that to me, it means that I've actually spent enough time talking to them about it.
Oh, nice. I think that's a really nice way of looking at it, isn't it? I mean, something I say to people is, yes, I'm a firm believer in clinical trials, because that's the way in which our field evolves. But actually, when that person is with me in the room, they are always my number one priority. Great if they can go into trial, but for whatever reason, if they choose not to, that is absolutely fine. And like you say, these trials are tightly regulated, and a trial in itself could not open unless there is a significant chance that trial is going to benefit the patient who is going to enter into it. You can't be offering treatment in a clinical trial which is not going to be as good as you'd think. It just simply wouldn't get through the regulatory framework. So these trials, when they're set up, go through a whole lot of scrutiny. Experts in the field, spend years of their life kind of designing them to make sure that they are going to stand the test of time and be of benefit for everybody who participates in them. So, I think it's a complex discussion. It does take time. And like you say, maybe when someone does step away, hopefully, you've done it pretty well.
We've got to a natural part of the discussion now where we should sum up really for Sally. What are the pros and cons of entering a clinical trial? And hopefully that will help people. So, should we start with pros and then we can go to cons? We can do one each.
Let's do one each. Well, the pros each. You're not going to do. You're in the pro corner and I'm in the con corner. Let's stick with the pros. All right, pros. So you get access potentially to new treatments which may work better than the treatments which you'd otherwise get. You will likely have more monitoring and closer and more detailed medical care.
Trial nurses are slightly separate and funded differently from normal nurses, and people on clinical trial have a dedicated trial nurse, which isn't usually the case if you're having a standard of care treatment, and that can be really, really good.
I guess something which is really important is you're contributing through entering into a clinical trial to the body of knowledge of understanding about your condition, in this case myeloma, and the treatments that work well. And I think that can be very, very persuasive for some people.
The way in which NHS care is funded for myeloma, you're allowed certain treatments at certain time points in your journey. Going onto a clinical trial actually offers you an extra line of treatment and may allow you to get treatments that are already licensed in, for example, say a later line. You may be able to access that drug earlier. That is potentially a very safe way of getting an approved treatment at an earlier line. So I think a nice example of that, Sally, is with a bispecific antibody. There is a trial at the moment that we're running in Oxford where you can get that drug at second line potentially, whereas if you were having it as standard of care only, you may get it at fourth line. So it is an approved drug, but you're potentially getting it slightly earlier. Now, there are still pros and cons for that, and it may not be the right thing to have it earlier, but it is potentially an advantage.
Yeah, and that's where the nuanced conversation comes in, doesn't it? Something else that people frequently say in clinic, which is just lovely actually, is that people often say, I just want to help other people, and if they can learn from me, then that's great. And I think sometimes that feeling of you're giving back a bit can also be quite persuasive, and clinical trials can enable that.
And it's so lovely to hear that. And when I do hear it, which is amazingly often, I do explain that that's not the primary reason that they should do it. But as a side effect, if that helps them feel happy to do it, then that's really lovely. If it is a trial that is sponsored by a pharmaceutical company who are the developers of the new agents that we are using, and even the established agents that we now use in myeloma, you normally get your travel expenses paid. And this can be extremely helpful, and that can be taxis, mileage, whatever it is. Coming into hospital regularly for treatment can be tiring and exhausting, and there is a cost associated with that. So potentially to have your taxi fees paid for a whole length of time is potentially very appealing.
Agree. And, there may be some other ways of sort of minimising the inconvenience of trials, which sort of leads us nicely perhaps onto the cons of trials, Jam. Do you want to kick off what you should think about if you don't want to do it?
The cons of trials, eminence-based medicine, Sally. I know best. You don't need to go on a trial. So I'm transporting myself back to the 1870s there. No, there are cons of trials, and I think it's important that we do talk about them. The intervention you have, the drug that you have, may not work. You may be getting it very early in its development. It may be at a dose that is much too low to be effective. For example, CAR T in myeloma, these engineered T cells, when these are developed, they give different levels of different amounts of T cells, and they generally go up in number as they're working out what is potentially safe. If you're in right at the beginning, it may not be enough. We don't know. It also may be too many. So if you're entering a trial in phase 1 or even in any of the earlier phases, the intervention might not work for you.
That's a really good point. I think what's important, say, for early phase trials, they're often offered to people, aren't they, where treatment options might be more limited. And so actually you have to choose where you place your early phase trial, because if there's really, really, really good other options available which are highly likely to work, that may not be the right approach. I think one disadvantage of clinical trials depends perhaps on your pain threshold or how happy you are visiting hospital, but you might need to come in more often, you might need more blood tests, you might need more bone marrow tests or more scans. And so,
bone marrows, more bone marrow. We hear it a lot, that it's often usually the liquid bit only, the aspirate bit. But Sally, I'm sure you've had the same. I've had patients saying, I like the idea of the trial, but I'm sorry, I'm not having a bone marrow.
Definitely. And people step away from trials for that reason, which makes complete sense. And also the fact that, so often now, I hope myeloma is about getting on and living your life. And perhaps if you've got to turn up to hospital more frequently, you're less able to go on holiday. You're less able to do those things that you might otherwise wish or choose to do. And I think that can be a significant disadvantage. And that's definitely worth paying attention to.
Another disadvantage is that, say that your intervention worked well for you for, a good length of time. They're very standardized criteria that tell us when you have to stop that treatment. They're based on protein levels getting to a certain level, for example. But what we know is that some treatments still potentially can have an effect even after certain sort of thresholds have been met. And in a trial, you can't continue a drug longer than is specified in the protocol. This protocol, this big document that we have to use, defines everything that we have to do. And there is much less space in clinical trials for what we call clinical pragmatism. When we treat people day to day with routine treatments, we can change doses of X, Y, and Z. We can miss a week or two here. We can, within reason, do many things that gives us a lot of flexibility. And you can't do that in a trial as much. There is some flexibility built in, but it's not the same, right?
Totally. I mean, that brings us back to our steroid podcast with our listeners who've heard that already, where we spoke about those really big doses of steroids, which can be quite problematic for a fair amount of people. And actually in clinical trials, that is, as you say, it's often stipulated you need to take a particular dose unless there's a very good reason not to. Whereas in clinical practice, we might say, we'll just fiddle around with this a bit and see what works best for you. That the fiddling is much more defined, isn't it? It's much more specific for good reason, for the reasons we've already said. I'm trying to think of some other cons, Dan. I think I've run up against a con blank. Have you got any more roaming around in your mind?
I think we've covered the big ones. I did say, of course, the intervention may not work. There's also the piece around side effects, understanding what side effects are related to a drug or potentially the myeloma or potentially other medical conditions that our patients may have. Sometimes people get unexpected side effects, and the way in which a drug is used in a trial, often 5-10 years later, you're using it in a completely different way off trial. And again, I think to use an example, I think bortezomib, Velcade, when it was first developed, people weren't sure how to give it, but it was given intravenously twice a week. And that led to lots of people getting very difficult neuropathy, which was very, very problematic for many patients. Now, 15-20 years later, we know that you only give Velcade broadly once a week and you give it as an injection under the skin, and we understand that side effect so well. So you may be exposed to side effects that are more problematic than they would be in 10 years, but that's because of the nature of understanding how drugs work and seeing many more thousands of people treated over many years. But it should be remembered that back then, when those first patients were given Velcade, yes, some got neuropathy, but they were also given a transformational treatment for their myeloma. Yeah,
they were the pioneers, and they, led the way for the rest of us to then learn about it in clinical practice and develop it further. So I guess thank you for sharing that, because I think it's a really interesting sort of point to come to perhaps at the end, is actually clinical trials are often just a beginning, aren't they? Then when you, as we said earlier, roll the drugs out into day-to-day routine practice, the understanding and the learning continues. And that's what our patients do with us every day, is they tell us how they've been, what's been going on in their lives. And we ourselves then learn and then employ that knowledge with the next person that we see. So it's an ongoing process, really. It's lifelong learning. And clinical trials really fire the starting gun in that regard.
If you are offered a clinical trial in your time when you're in clinic or seeing your doctor, have a good think about it. It might be for you. It may be exactly the thing that you need at that point in time. Take some time to think about it, discuss it with your friends and family, reach out to patient charities. And we know that for so many people, trials have really given them something amazing that's really helped them along their journey. And you can also come and talk to us. Communicate with us, tell us your stories about clinical trials and what's gone well, what maybe hasn't gone so well. And over the next few weeks, we're hoping to get a number of patients on the podcast about a number of topics. So maybe that's something we'll cover as well, Sally.
Yeah, absolutely. Look forward to it. I think there's lots to cover. Thanks again to you all for listening and enabling us to chat about this really interesting area, which often I think doesn't get the attention it needs, but really is a cornerstone of all that we do. Thank you.
Thanks for your company today, and look forward to seeing you at the next one. This has been the Myeloma Minutes. We hope that you found today's pod engaging, interesting, and above all, useful and understandable. Please remember that this does not constitute medical advice, Thank you so much for listening. Please do feedback on what you've enjoyed and what you'd like more of. You can email us at themyelomaminutes@gmail.com, and we'll see you at the next one. Bye.